Now, on to tonight's subject. Records management is one of those really vital core functions that each ESD needs to be familiar with. With that in mind, we're very lucky to have with us tonight Angela Osser from the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. Sorry about that. Angela is a record management consultant for state and local government agencies, such as ESDs, at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. She provides training and assistance on records retention, filing, safeguarding, and long-term preservation. Before joining the State Library in 2009, Angela worked for the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Texas at San Antonio, and Texas Legislative Council. She is a certified archivist with a Master of Science in Library Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Safety is glad to welcome Angela tonight to tell us what ESDs need to know about records management. Angela?
Okay, thank you, Clay, and thank you to Safety. It is an honor to be here. So the topic of today's webcast is Records Retention 101. So this is sort of just the basics of records management for an ESD. There are a lot of retention rules to keep straight, and so my job today, and really just kind of in general, is to help you keep all of those rules straight. So here's what I want you to take away from the webcast. So first, you'll have a basic understanding of the laws and rules for records management in an ESD. You'll know why records management is important, not just for legal compliance, but for overall efficiency and cost reduction. You'll know where to go to find out how long to keep each kind of your records. And then you'll have an idea of what sort of documentation we recommend keeping on the destruction of your records. And finally, you'll know what 3 documents you need to file with my agency, the Texas State Library, which I will refer to as TSLAC, to be in compliance with the Local Government Records Act. So let me tell you a little bit about my agency and our basic role. I work in the Records Management Assistance Unit of TSLAC, which includes 6 government information analysts. And we answer questions on every aspect of records management: retention, destruction, managing electronic records, email, long-term preservation, disaster planning, you name it. And we are basically the records management help desk for Texas government agencies. Before we go on, I would recommend bookmarking this webpage right here. This is where you'll find all of the forms, publications, and records retention schedules that we'll be talking about today. So what is records management and why do we bother doing it? Well, let's start with, why do we have records retention rules? Well, because in Texas we have very broad open government, open records laws that apply to pretty much every single thing you've ever written, recorded, or thought about. We have open meetings rules to make sure that our governing bodies are conducting business in a transparent way. And the retention rules kind of support these other laws by making sure that the records you're required to create and to make available are actually kept and made available for an appropriate length of time. Records management is required by the Local Government Records Act of 1989, and the law cites the purpose of the act as follows. Number 1, to promote effective and economic government operations, so keeping costs down. To preserve and to identify and preserve records of permanent value, so making sure that records with historical value are being protected over time. And to establish some standards and procedures for the state, for local governments. And TSLAC, State Library, was put in a rulemaking role to kind of oversee that function. The Local Government Records Act is published on our website as a publication called Bulletin D, and Bulletin D provides the legal justification for all the important aspects of records management, which is another way of saying it answers a lot of "why do we have to do this?" questions. It includes several useful definitions, which we're about to discuss in more detail, and it outlines the role of the Records Management Officer, which maybe you're here today because you've been tapped to be that person. If so, congratulations. The law gives local governments the authority to dispose of records without notifying us, okay, as long as you're in compliance with the law. And it outlines what the required compliance requirements are, which is something I'm going to talk about today. So why do we manage records? Well, first and foremost, because it's the law, but that's not the only reason we do it. Good records management helps you to respond for requests for information quickly. If you ever have to fulfill a public information request, an open records request, you know that you only have 10 days to respond to that inquiry. If records are managed well, then 10 days is practically nothing. If they are not, that's going to be exceedingly difficult, and that applies to finding information for audits, for litigation, and just regular old business need. Records management keeps your office running smoother because you don't have people wasting their time and effort hunting for information. Good records management protects your records. It means that you're taking measures to protect your records from things like mold, pests, floods, fires, hurricanes, vermin. I have actually seen pictures of records soaked in raccoon urine. That has happened. They are eaten by goats. You name it, we have heard of this. So in good records management, you kind of learn how to recognize these potential threats and sort of take actions to help prevent them. Records management gives you the ability to dispose of records as soon as you're able to, and of course that frees up storage and makes it easier to get to the records you need. It saves money, which is very important to all of us right now. Buying filing cabinets, finding space for them, paying to store records in a record center, even paying for electronic server storage. All of these things cost money. When you're freeing up storage and improving your efficiency, that helps to keep your costs down. And then legal protection. Good, consistent practices help you in a lawsuit. If your ESD is ever sued and a record is requested as part of the prosecution's discovery request, then that record has to be produced whether or not you could have destroyed it years earlier. So that means that keeping a record too long creates a vulnerability to your ESD that didn't have to exist. So we practice records management for a variety of reasons. So maybe you're thinking, all right, I already know this is going to be too much work. Can't we just keep everything? Sure, you can. But there are some negative consequences for keeping things too long. So first, you have storage costs. Paying for network server storage, buying filing cabinets, finding space for boxes, etc. As the volume of records increases, the time it takes to find anything also increases. Again, you have to protect those records from the disasters that I touched on, and that protection gets expensive. And then finally, I talked about the increased legal risk of keeping things too long, and I heard a county attorney phrase it this way: if you don't have it, they can't come get it from you. Okay, so why not just get rid of everything right now? Well, that's also not a good idea. Intentional destruction of a record prior to its required retention period is a Class A misdemeanor. If a judge decides that the destruction is considered tampering with a governmental record, then that is a third-degree felony, punishable by 2 to 10 years in jail and or a fine up to $10,000. And one could also be subject to criminal penalties and fines under the Public Information Act. Now, between us, I want you to remember the word intentional. If you know things have not been done right in the past, rest assured that no one is waiting outside your office with handcuffs right now. But there's no time like the present to learn about records retention and start to get in compliance. So let's start talking about the basics of records retention. The very first thing you need to know about records retention is, what is a record? Just what is the definition of a record? Well, a local government record, as defined by law, is any recorded information that documents the transaction of public business. It can be created or received by a local government. So it can be something that a government employee creates on their computer, or it can be something they receive, like, say, a permit application. Okay, either of those can be a record. Anything meeting these criteria is considered a record, even if it is exempt from disclosure under the Public Information Act or HIPAA or what have you. It does not affect its status as a record. And finally, a record can exist in any medium. So paper, electronics, sound, video recordings, microfilm, and that means that most emails are records. Telephone messages can be records. DVDs contain records. So the fact that it's on your computer does not make it any less of a local government record. So since almost everything you touch is a record, it can sometimes be easier to define what is a record by what is not. So there are a few categories of what we call non-records. And the first is convenience copies. So those are extra identical copies of records that you create for convenience of reference or research. And of course, in the digital age, it's very easy to have 17 convenience copies of exactly the same thing, especially if you're emailing it out to a lot of people. Those are not considered records. Next, copies of documents that you produce for an open records request. The request that you get in, any email back and forth with the requester, any attorney general opinions about that record, those are all records. But the actual copies of the documents that you make to furnish to the public are non-records, according to law. Other things that would be considered non-records would be blank forms or extra copies of any publications that you might be producing. And then finally, any library materials or museum materials. And museum materials are just kind of three-dimensional objects like a gavel or a uniform. Those are not records. Okay, so we've defined what a record is. Now let's think about sort of the bigger picture, because records management is not about managing individuals' computer files or scraps of paper. We have to kind of group these records together in order to manage them. And so let's think about some records that you might have at home. And we're going to look at your 2012 tax return. So this would be the one that you filed earlier this year. So you have a folder called 2012 tax return. So in there you might find some forms, right? Your 1040 form, your W-2, your 1099, etc. Maybe you're also keeping, if you're claiming deductions for charitable donations or medical bills or daycare, you might have receipts supporting that in case you're ever audited. And then you might have some other stuff in there, like if you submitted it through TurboTax and you got an email confirmation, maybe you're printing that out and keeping that in the record. So all of those records would be grouped together into what we would call the record series 2012 tax return. Let's look at an example from an actual from government. So if you've ever applied for a government job, you're familiar with the employment application. So when you submit an application for employment, you might also submit your resume, attach a cover letter, maybe a high school or college transcript, maybe a letter of reference. Well, all of those records are grouped together into a record series called employment application. And you can see that the record series includes all different kinds of formats. It doesn't matter what program you use to create it or what format it's in, it's all one record series, employment applications. Okay, we are almost done with definitions, I promise. Now let's talk about what a retention period is. The retention period is just the length of time that your ESD is required to keep a particular record. So still using our example of employment applications, the retention period applies to anything falling under that umbrella, and that retention period is 2 years. Of course, this is government we're talking about, and nothing can ever be super straightforward and simple, so it's a little more complicated than just a number of years a lot of times. So sometimes the retention period is just a number of years. So 1 year for a monthly activity report, 2 years for a performance appraisal, 30 years for workplace chemical lists. But often you're going to see one of these codes used in conjunction with numbers of years, and so that's why I kind of want to take a little bit of time to help explain what these codes mean. AV means as long as administratively valuable. So as long as the record has a business use to you, then you keep it. When it has no value to you anymore, then you can get rid of it. So to take an example of something with an AV retention period, did you know that your internet browsing history is a government record? Technically is a government record, and someone could put in a Public Information Act to request an employee's internet browsing history. It's true, but the retention is just AV. So whenever you have no use for that history anymore, you can delete it, okay? Next is CE, which is calendar year end, and that's simple. That's just December 31st. So a workers' compensation claim file has to be kept CE plus 5. So that means if your claim was dated today, then you would have to keep it until December 31st of 2018, right? CE plus 5. Next is FE, which means fiscal year end. I work for a state agency. Our fiscal year end is August 31st. A lot of financial records have a retention period of FE plus 3. So if I took something like a cash receipt dated today, our fiscal year end is August 31st of 2014. FE plus 3 means I have to keep that cash receipt until August 31st, 2017. Math. I was worried about doing that math right in my head. Okay, LA means life of the asset. So an asset is like an equipment, a piece of equipment, a building, what have you. And LA means you keep the records associated with that asset as long as you have the asset. So vehicle maintenance records, you have to keep LA plus 1. So 1 year after you have disposed of that vehicle, you can get rid of the records about the vehicle. PM is easy because that's permanent, and that means you never destroy it. And then US means until superseded, so until it's replaced by an updated version. One example is disaster plans. If you have some kind of plan or during an emergency disaster, you have to keep those US plus 5. So 5 years after that disaster plan has been updated, then you can get rid of the old one. Okay, so now a records retention schedule. And a records retention schedule, which I have heard described as an Orwellian term, like very big brother, but it's a document that is really at the heart of your records management program, because a retention schedule is the document that lists all of your records and tells you how long you have to keep them. TSLAC, my agency, publishes 12 retention schedules for all different kinds of local governments. And these 12 schedules include over 1,500 record series. They tell you the mandatory minimum length of time you have to keep your records. There are, like I said, there are 12 schedules, and some of these apply to an ESD and some don't. Everyone uses local schedule GR, no matter where you work, and I'm going to talk just briefly about that one. But beyond that, an ESD is also going to use local schedule PS, because that is the retention schedule that has public safety records, records of firefighting and emergency service. And let's see, some ESDs also use Schedule EL if you are doing your own elections and you have things like ballots, that falls under Schedule EL. And then some ESDs who do their own property taxation, if you have any kind of tax collection or taxing records, those are under Schedule TX. Okay, so you will definitely use GR and PS, and then possibly EL and TX. Local Schedule GR includes records that are common to all kinds of local governments, cities, school districts, MUDs, ESDs, everybody uses Schedule GR. Part 1 of Schedule GR is where you're going to find administrative records. So records like your board meeting minutes and your correspondence and contracts, insurance policies. Those are administrative records. Financial records, it's what it sounds like. It's accounting records, budget, financial reports. Part 3 is personnel and payroll, so your employee records. Part 4 is for support services records, and that's where you're going to find things like purchasing and maintenance records. And then Part 5 is information technology records, so that's records of computer systems. Okay, Local Schedule PS is for records of public safety agencies. And there are 2 parts of Schedule PS that apply to ESDs. Part 1, which is records common to all public safety agencies, and Part 4, which is records of firefighting and emergency medical service agencies. So here's a question I have gotten at a few safety conferences. A lot of y'all contract with outside service providers. And so, for example, operational records like EMS run reports would be held by the EMS contractor, not necessarily the ESD. Well, there's an answer to this question, but there is one answer for fire and there's one answer for EMS. So, because it's based on how each of those are regulated. So let's look at fire to begin with. So I emailed the Texas Commission on Fire Protection to ask them this question, and they said that a fire protection provider is subject to all the same rules and regulations as the ESD, as if they were a government organization. So, and it says officially subject to the same rules if they provide fire protection to a local government entity for profit under a contract or other agreement, and would be a fire department if the organization were a department of local government entity. So that's not just a recommendation of TCPF, that is actual administrative rule. Okay, now for EMS, this is not written in the law or the rules, but I asked the Texas Department of State Health Services for help with this one because they are the most familiar with the EMS Act in the Health and Safety Code. The EMS Act regulates ambulance providers and EMS personnel. Anyway, they said that when the EMS provider contracts with an ESD to act as the ESD's agent, the ESD is usually going to or should stipulate that the EMS provider must maintain its records in accordance with the ESD's retention rules. And they also made the point that EMS providers most often function under the direction of a licensed physician, and the personnel out there are kind of acting as the eyes and ears of that doctor, and the doctor is required by the Texas Medical Board to follow certain retention requirements. And so their employment contract, you know, the EMTs with that provider are that most likely would or should cover this issue of record keeping and records retention. But it is recommended by DSHS that you include some stipulation in the contract that the EMS provider will comply with local government retention rules. But I don't believe you actually have to physically have them in your office. Okay, so by now, you understand that records retention is governed by retention schedules, and hopefully I've given you the links of where to go to get those. So let's say you go download them, you open them up. Here is what they are going to look like. Let's talk about how to read one of these things. So the first thing you're going to see is the record number, and that is a unique number that is assigned by us that just helps us uniquely identify that record versus the other 1,499. Next, you'll have the record title. You may call it something completely different. This is the title that we've assigned it. Next, you have the record description. So that just kind of defines the scope of that record series. It tells you what falls under that series. You have the retention period, of course, the length of time you have to keep it. And then we'll tell you if that retention period is based on some sort of rule or law, we'll tell you why that is. So certified audio tapes of closed meetings have to be kept for 2 years under the Texas Public Information Act. So now I just want to go over a few actual examples of records that you or your service provider probably have. The first example is contracts, leases, and agreements. And this would include your contract with your service provider. You have to keep any contracts, leases, or agreements for 4 years after the expiration or termination of that contract. Next example is your budget working papers. I intentionally did not make this the actual budget because that's going to be on a later slide, but just kind of the documentation that you pull together to actually create your budget. So all of those kinds of records are kept for 2 years. Next, a record from Schedule PS, the public safety schedule, radio and paging logs, listing of each radio call or pages from or to a dispatcher showing date, time, and location of the call. The logs have to be kept for 1 year. And then an EMS provider's EMS run report. The retention depends on whether treatment was rendered. If treatment was rendered, then the report has to be kept the later of 6 years and 3 months from the date of treatment or until the patient's 20th birthday. If treatment was refused, then the reports can be destroyed 2 years after the date of contact with the person. So probably you'd want to keep those in 2 separate files, one for treatment rendered and one for treatment refused. I wanted to give a few examples of permanent records of an ESD. So these are records that have to be retained indefinitely because they have some kind of long-term historical value. So some examples would be your board meeting minutes, resolutions of the board, annual budgets, and annual financial reports. So sometimes I get calls where people say, I have these meeting minutes going back to like 1980, and I say, good. Somebody's been doing something right. You want to keep records of what you destroy because this is useful information if a record is ever requested, again, as part of a Public Information Act request or an audit. And I'm just going to actually look at an example here instead of talking about that. So this is what a records disposition log looks like. And you can download a blank one of these on our website. And so you'll be listing, and the first 3 columns are actually taken from the records retention schedule. So either Schedule GR, Schedule PS, or EL. And you're going to list, so you're going to look at the record and figure out, what it is. And then you're going to look at the schedule to try to classify it under our rule, right? So you're going to list the record number, the title, and the retention period from the schedule. In the next column from to dates, you're going to list the actual dates of the records you want to destroy. For the disposition method, there's a legend at the bottom that lists a few codes, and that just basically says how the record was destroyed. If it is a confidential record, it has to be burned or shredded or pulped by law, pulping being a chemical process where you mix paper with chemicals until it dissolves. Open records can be destroyed by landfill burial or recycling. But in that disposition method column, you're just kind of certifying these records were shredded, for example. You'll list the volume of the records, so 10 boxes, 1 file folder, whatever. And you can see that this also includes electronic records. You can see on there the budget working papers. You know, maybe these were Excel spreadsheets and they're electronic, so you would list D for delete, and the volume becomes 25 gigabytes or 35 megabytes or what have you. And then in the last couple columns, you're kind of talking about when the records were actually tossed in the recycle bin or actually deleted. So you list the actual disposition date, maybe you initial, maybe you attach something to it, you put an X in the end. What documentation you keep on the records you destroy is completely up to you. We will never see this form. You can take this form and change it around. You could fill out one column of it. We will never see it. We don't care. This is really just to kind of assist you. We do recommend that you keep a record like this, but it is not required. Now we're going to talk about compliance. So even if some functions are outsourced to a third-party provider, compliance is still the duty of the ESD. So compliance is something you should care about because this is what gives you the legal authority to dispose of records. When you are not in compliance, you cannot delete any records. And remember that almost everything is a record, so you cannot even delete an email that is just a lunch invitation. There are 3 elements of compliance, and I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. The first one is your ESD's board has to adopt a records management policy. The ESD must appoint a records management officer, which I'll be referring to as the RMO, and you have to make a records retention decision. So let's talk about the policy first. Policy Model 4, which is the one there's a little picture of here, this is the template that we suggest for smaller local governments. The policy basically defines what a record is. It acknowledges that records are the property of the ESD and they don't belong to any one individual. And the most important thing it tells us is who is your records management officer. This is usually done by position in the policy, not by name. And some common RMO positions are board secretary, board president, district administrator. We have no rules regarding who has to be the RMO, so it's really just up to the board and who they want to appoint. And then once that RMO is designated, you file a copy of that policy with us and then some sort of documentation showing that it was approved. So it could just be a cover letter that you attach to it saying this policy was approved at our June 7th meeting. Or it could be a copy of the meeting minutes. It doesn't matter. We just need something that shows that this actually was approved. So that's compliance element number 1. Compliance element number 2 is designating your records management officer, and that's done with the SLR 504 form. So in your policy, you've told us what position is the records management officer. With this form, you're just telling us the name of the person in that position. And the law requires that you tell us within 30 days of a change if that person leaves and a new one comes in. A little closer look at this form. In the top, you're going to list your, this is the bottom half of this form. But anyway, under government, you're just going to list the name and number of your ESD. The number 2, position designated in policy, this really trips people up, but this is just the position that your board has approved to be the RMO for your ESD. So if they've designated the board secretary, you'll put board secretary right there. And you do have to sign and mail an original form to us. We can't accept faxed or scanned copies. They do have to be mailed because they have your signature on them. The third element of compliance is deciding on a plan for records retention. And this plan is what's going to give you the authority to dispose of records. And you have options for this element as well. The first option is to not have a records retention schedule and state in your policy that you are going to keep every single record permanently. The second option is to adopt one or more of the retention schedules published by TSLAC. And for this, you fill out a form that says that you are adopting our schedules in lieu of developing your own. And we're going to look at that form. And the third option is to create your own schedule. Oh, there it is. Okay. And then, okay, so let's talk about each of these options, starting with a very brief discussion of the no schedule option. If you don't have a schedule, it means that you don't have to submit a SLR 508 for a declaration of compliance form or records control schedule. However, you do have to keep every record forever. You can't delete any emails, any meeting agendas, any cash receipts, etc. So it's a slightly less work, but also you're going to end up with a lot of records. But it is something that you can do. The next option is to declare compliance with TSLAC schedules in lieu of creating your own schedules. So for this, you submit a one-page form, the SLR 508, saying that you will adopt our schedules. So taking a closer look at that form. So this is the top half, or top third, where you tell us who you are. This is the middle part. This is where you're checking off the schedules that you're going to adopt. And like I said, an ESD always checks off Schedule GR and Schedule PS, and then optionally Schedule EL or TX. Okay? And then the last section, you're telling us that this form, this declaration, this plan to adopt our schedules either replaces what has already been on file for your ESD or does not replace. And I'm just going to tell you the short answer to which one should I do is check the box next to are superseded by this declaration. It gets very complicated if you have multiple retention policies in place. Okay, and then leave the gray part blank. That's where we get to sign. Okay, and now you have one more option for the records schedule requirement. And we have a whole class on this, so this is really just a very brief mention of kind of how this works. So the option C is a records control schedule. And so for this option, you need to take an inventory of your records. You go around, you list the record series title and description and the dates, take a full inventory of all the records in your office, and then you list them on this form SLR 500. You then have to reference our schedules to make sure that the retention periods you're listing meet our minimums, because you can keep things longer, but you can't keep things shorter. And then you attach a signature page, which is the form SLR 540, and the RMO does have to sign that form. Just a quick comparison of those two options. So the declaration of compliance is certainly easier to fill out. It's easier to file. It's approved within a week or two. There is no need to refile when our new schedules are published. You just start following the new guidelines. And so for some people, this is an easy decision because they just want to go with the fastest, easiest option. And the declaration of compliance is definitely the fastest, easiest option. A records control schedule does have its benefits. Because it is based on an inventory of only your records, there's nothing on it that doesn't apply to you, so it's very customized. If you're in a bigger organization, sometimes folks will divide this. So like a city submitting a records control schedule will have a different section for each department. That helps them. And then if you have any records that for some reason aren't on TSLAC schedules, you would be able to list them on a records control schedule. If you want something that is kind of customized and localized and maybe a little more user-friendly, then I would recommend the records control schedule. But if you don't have a lot of records or you just want to get in compliance quickly, I would say go with the declaration. So just to recap what you're supposed to have on file with TSLAC, number one, the records management policy, and policy model 4, again, is the one that we suggest for smaller local governments. Make sure that your board approves that policy and you file a copy of the policy and of the approval documentation with us. The second thing is your records management officer, so make sure that your policy designates an RMO, and then fill out that SLR 504 form where you tell us who that person is. And then the records retention schedule. The fast track, the easiest way is to do the SLR 508 form, and again, you're going to adopt schedules GR, PS, EL, and TX. So, to conclude, so to review our objectives up top, so we define what a record is and what is a non-record, and we went over all those exciting definitions like retention period and retention schedule. We talked about the records retention rules and the retention schedules, and hopefully we talked enough about how to read and interpret them. Although if you have questions, which I hope you do, I'll definitely talk about those in the Q&A. So you know how to read a retention schedule. You should have some idea of what you need to submit to the state library, and hopefully you know where to go for more information. And actually, let me just go to the next slide, because this is where you can go to find the analyst who's assigned to your county. You are welcome at any time to contact any of the analysts you want. If you want to contact me directly, you are welcome to. If you cannot stand the sound of my voice for another second, then you can call one of my colleagues. If you just want to call our general contact line, our main line, we have our main information there. You can just shoot us an email. And one thing we can do for you is we can tell you what compliance documentation you have on file with us. We have all of these records going back to 1990, so we can tell you whatever policies you've filed, whatever forms, whatever schedules you've adopted, we have it on file and we can easily email that to you. And so I want to leave you with an easy action plan that is imminently doable, I promise. Number one, call or email your analyst, or call me to check your compliance status. All you have to do is send us an email or call, and we will tell you what your status is, and we'll tell you what you need to do next if you're missing something. Next, if you don't have a records management officer, decide who this lucky person will be, and they can coordinate with us at the state library to look at what records might be eligible for destruction and free up some space and reduce costs. And then finally, even if you're already in compliance, be sure to take a look at the latest editions of Schedules GR and PS. If it's been a few years, these rules were all updated in 2011, so I'd highly recommend going to our website and making sure you have the most recent edition of those rules. And with that, I say thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. A lot of information there. Thank you so much, Angela. If you have questions for Angela about her presentation, anything to do with records management, I should say records management, not just records retention. There's so much more than just keeping documents. I often say records retention because that's the policy you have to have, but there's so much more into records management. Well, anyway, you can call in, text in, fax in, or email in your questions at any time. Please get those into us now, though we only have a little more time for questions. Here's how. For phone, you're going to call 512-251-8101. For email, you're going to email us at safed@texas.net. That's SAFED at Texas, spelt out, TEXAS.net. You can fax your questions into 512-251-8152, or go ahead and text me right here at 512-567-0857. Normal text messaging rates do apply. I want to, real quickly, before we get to this question that was handed in to me, I want to talk just basics, because I know, and well, maybe I don't know, but I'm thinking that there might be some folks out there who are a little bit, seeing things through a new lens right now. Probably didn't maybe realize. You got to remember, ESD commissioners are all volunteers. They come to this job just out of desire to serve their community, and they don't always, realize how many. Is bureaucratic the right word, or sort of different logistics they have to go through when it comes to maintaining a government agency or a governmental entity like an ESD. So the basics right now, and you said, I saw in that last year action plan, call a compliance officer. Let's say they're a little shy. For starters, what's the main thing we have to have? We have to have a records retention policy, right? We have to have a records management officer, right?
Yes.
So those are two things that have to be in existence. Now the form that tells you who the officer is, that's the SLR 504.
Yeah.
504. The 508 is the one that is for compliance, right? See, I can learn stuff too.
That's good. Yeah, I'm impressed.
So the 504 is the one that has to be on file within 30 days of a new records management officer, right?
Right.
The 504.
So let me clarify. Okay, there is no records police. We are not. I even shy away from compliance officer. I'm definitely, we are here. Our unit is records management assistants. We are only here to assist. Okay, so there is no. Please have no fear in calling us, because really all we are here to do is just to kind of explain what the rules are and to kind of tell you what you might need to file with us. So I would say at a very basic level, adopt a policy. Because, not just because you're required to, but just because it's a very basic framework. So at least you are just acknowledging that you're aware of the requirement, that records are, considered public property of the ESD. It just kind of certifies that it is important to your board to, conduct business, to, cross your eye or
cross the T's, dot the
yes, thank
I's.
you.
Yeah.
Yes, and then to designate a records management officer, just so we have a contact person that we can communicate with.
Sure.
And then beyond that, it's a viable policy, especially if you're in a really small place where you're not going to have time to go and do an inventory and pull records for destruction. At least if you can make sure that the permanent records are being protected, that's something that's very important, just to make sure that the legacy of your ESD, the written record of your ESD lives on.
So just for anyone who maybe just got appointed or just realized we've never been doing any of this, the basic steps are get the policy, get a records management officer on file, and call this lovely lady right here, because they are not the bad guy. You are not the bad guy. You're not gonna tell anyone. You're here to help, and you have schedules and a ton of other resources right there on your website.
Yeah.
That retention schedules that you can just look at and adopt. So let's get to an ESD specific question that I was handed, and I noticed this during your presentation, and I had the same thought. Is an ESD liable if its contractor doesn't follow the records retention policy?
Well, the problem with trying to answer that is that I am not a lawyer, and also because we have absolutely no enforcement ability, or I can't say. I mean, I would say if you had it in your contract that provider was supposed to be following those retention rules, that's really all you can do.
Right.
I mean, you can't, that's just how ESDs seem to work, is you have these service providers in a lot of cases where, I don't think like I said, you're not required to actually have the records there in your offices. The best you can do is just to document that you had that in your contract, and that's, yeah.
I want to go really quickly. So even though there are no records retention police, that's not TSLAC's, at least
right.
Not y'all's job. There are negative consequences, as you stated in the presentation, to not keeping up with your records management program. And one thing that caught my attention in the presentation was you called TCFP, and they said that the provider is subject to the same rules and regulations. So
right.
If I'm understanding correctly, it is the opinion of the Texas Commission on Fire Protection, I realize that's not your organization, that say an ESD is contracting with a volunteer fire department, a 501c3 nonprofit
mm-hmm.
organization. If those requirements that you stated in your presentation are met, that nonprofit entity is subject to the same records retention guidelines
right.
and responsibilities that the ESD would be if they're I think one of the requirements was if they were a fire department, as if they were a fire department.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very important, I think, for a lot of y'all out there to understand that your service providers may have some responsibility in this, especially when it comes to call records, response time records, anything like that. Everyone needs to get on the same page, let's say.
I would think that probably the service provider would be liable, and again, not an attorney.
Right.
Can't speak to that, but
Angela is not an attorney. Let's
definitely an archivist.
Nor am I. So let's not an ESD attorney. So let's
right. But I would think, I would hope anyway that contract would protect you, because again, it is administrative rule which carries the force of law. governing that service, the service provider, again for fire, not for EMS, but basically the law governs that provider does follow the same retention rules that you would be subject to. So,
right. Well, there are their own issues with the EMS, and so I think the best thing to say in this situation, if you are an ESD that contracts with a service provider, an outside independent service provider, you should make sure and probably not only be on the same page, but also make sure the records retention or records management of your service provider is something that's stated in the contract and everyone knows what's going to happen if there is a records question.
right.
But again, we are not your attorney, and you should ask your own independent counsel on those issues. We have about exhausted our time for tonight, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Be sure to be on the lookout for all the information on Safety's 13th, can you believe it? 13th annual conference. That's scheduled for January 23rd through the 25th at the Moody Gardens Hotel and Convention Center in beautiful Galveston. For more information, as always, go to www.safe-d.org. Now, for the moment that a lot of you are very interested in, to apply for your 1 hour of credit from tonight's webcast, go to, and here's your website. Hopefully it's below me. I'm being told it is below me. www.safe-d.org/lastmonday1309, as in September 09, Y, the letter Y, that's important, .pdf. And that PDF there is going to use the password saddlebag, all one lowercase word, SADDLEBAG. Again, www.safe-d.org/lastmonday1309y.pdf. And the password for that PDF is saddlebag, all lowercase, SADDLEBAG. So, that's our webcast for tonight. Thank you again to Angela Osser of the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. I always call it TSLAC too, so
great.
It takes me a minute to sound it out. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. Keep checking the safety newsletters, both print and electronic, and our website for information about future webcasts and training opportunities. From beautiful Pflugerville, Texas, and here at Safety Headquarters, I'm Clay Avery.